I hope you are ready for some incoherent rambling as I attempt to articulate my thoughts on the metaphysics of identity and all that fun stuff. I am not a philosophy expert, don't take what I say here overly seriously, but I do think this is a very interesting topic and I want to talk about it. Today I want to talk about our understanding of personhood, the metaphysics of identity. More specifically, I want to talk about two questions of importance to our understanding of personhood. Firstly, what makes someone the same person? And secondly, what makes someone worthy of personhood? Some people may find these questions confronting due to their connection with dehumanization and the horrors it normally takes place aside. Still, this is undeniably an issue of extreme importance philosophically, and I am going to attempt to articulate my views on the subject. I invite criticism, and I think discussion of ideas like this one is the best way to improve our understandings and come up with the best and most rational conclusions. Anyways, let's begin by discussing what makes someone the same person. What makes you the same person that you were 10 years ago? I want rational justifications. Obviously, in the English language, it is just a fact that this is how we communicate, and referring to your past self as you is essential to communication. But let's try to find a more rational grounding for this idea. It could be argued that there is actually a utility in viewing past selves as more deeply distinct from the modern self, as this would be a linguistic embrace of the idea that people can change massively, and would perhaps aid us in understanding both ourselves and others more accurately. The opposite could also be argued. It could be said we find our identity, not with a group of currently existing people, but with a group of past selves, who we identify far more closely with. We understand ourselves and who we are today through our identification with this group of past selves. We identify with the past selves' achievements and accomplishments, and the experiences of these past selves help us understand who it is that we are today. It could be said our present and past selves form the ultimate in-group, one which will always be essential to how we understand ourselves, and the one which it is hardest for our identity to stray furthest from. The past selves are a selection of individuals through time, who we identify with because we share one journey. They are in a group who helps us understand who we are. We share a journey, we share a consciousness, we share a biological form through time and space. Perhaps this identification with this in-group makes our current understanding of ourselves an inevitable part of our psychology, which sees us identify ourselves with this ultimate in-group, and understand ourselves according to this in-group. We can detach ourselves to some extent from any in-group, but this one is considerably harder to detach from than the others. I expect some to point out that what makes us the same individual is simply sharing a place in space and time. What we share that space with is often in many ways different to ourselves, and could easily be viewed as its own social in-group that we identify with because we share the place in space and time. Some will claim an in-group must exist with the individual, and not before the individual. The unhealthy obsession of many with ancestor worship makes it perfectly evident that the in-group does not have to exist at the present time. I think it could easily be said that our past selves form a special kind of in-group which our current self identifies with. It could, in my view, easily be stated that this is the ultimate in-group, so great we don't even consider it to be one and take identification with it for granted, as an inevitable reality of existence itself. Of course, one of the reasons language exists is to help us accurately understand and explain things, meaning the idea of such an adjustment or continuation to our understanding of who we are through time should be taken seriously. It is also worth noting language is not just about communication. It aids us greatly in our ability to understand and consider ourselves, as well as the surrounding reality. Language helps us think, not just communicate. Perhaps having terms which distinguish between the past and current self to a greater extent is a good idea, if we do believe that people can massively change. I can imagine it being said that this would be misused by people who would do bad things and constantly claim to have changed. If a person repeatedly did such a thing, with such an immoral intent, they would evidently not have changed at all, and would have been the same person the whole time, an immoral opportunist desperately attempting to exploit a particular understanding of reality. But when I say a person can change and become someone else, what do I actually mean by that? Here we get into what actually makes a person who they are. This will get into a very interesting game of isolating and examining variables. It is safe to say that today what makes someone the same person is typically viewed as a hodgepodge of factors, primarily relating to shared genetics and shared upbringing with the past self. One biological self is shared between present, past, and future selves for the entire journey, so this seems to currently be the defining understanding of what makes someone the same person. This is in many ways derived from religious understandings of an immortal soul, which makes people the same person through their whole lives. Yet the personality and mental faculties are not entirely ignored either in this somewhat incoherent amalgamation of factors that makes someone's past, present, and future versions worthy of being categorized largely as one. Would we call someone the same person if one day their entire personality and all of their preferences radically changed? What if their appearance also changed massively? The answer will of course differ from individual to individual, but I think most of us would call them the same person due to the sharing of the biological mass with the previous self. The biological mass seems to in a sense define the self, but in some ways this is deeply at odds with the idea of the soul, which is held by many. It is also at odds with the idea that we shouldn't be biological essentialists or anything of the sort. The self cannot simultaneously be defined as a soul and a shared biological mass. This is a contradiction, and one widely held. What about if when someone died their personality was somehow allowed to live on separate from the body in some kind of piece of technology? Perhaps a robot or computer. Would this be the same person? If we say no, then we categorize people primarily based on the sharing of a biological shell. If we say yes, we are primarily concerned with the changing mental states inside of that organism, and it therefore seems absurd to claim the previous example of a radically changing personality in the same biological shell is the same person. When we discuss the idea of the soul, the immortal soul, it is also important to note that there isn't exactly a lot of evidence for this supernatural and spiritual idea. Evidence is very important here. We know biology is real, we know consciousness and personality are real, but we really don't know if the soul is real. In fact, it seems like the immortal soul does not exist. Anyway, back to the point of discussing the changing personality and the self. By these standards, people whose personalities change massively through time would be fundamentally different people. Is a dead man the same person? The biological mass is shared, but it no longer holds the life that could be said to be central to its significance as the same person. We would probably call them the same person, but at what point of decomposition do they cease to be? Or is the self, in fact, just a life? Is the self something which shares a life with all the previous versions of the self? A set of atoms that once long ago composed a person would most certainly not be seen as the same person. Is this because they no longer share a life? Is it because they no longer share a personality? Is it because they no longer share an immortal soul? Perhaps as soon as they are dead, they are no longer the same person because it is the shared life that makes the selves one. This is likely untrue, however. If someone could take the life from another and use that life to live longer themselves, we would likely not call them the same person, and doing so seems absurd. If someone had an organ transplant from someone else that saved their life, would that count as them taking on that person's life and therefore becoming a different person? I don't think so. I don't think a shared life defines the self. What if rather than dead the person was simply unconscious? Then the shared life, which would be seen as the most significant feature, would remain central to the understanding of many that this is the same person. A further discussion can be held over the longevity of said unconsciousness. During sleep, fainting, or a similar temporary state of unconsciousness, we would likely call someone the same self they were previously, as we understand this to be a deeply temporary state, and they will in time be back as they were with all their characteristics, personality, preferences, and all that which we view as defining them as oneself. But what if they are permanently unconscious, and defining features such as personality and preference will never return? Are they still the same person simply because they share the same biological shell and life? What do you think makes you who you are? Is there one thing that you think if taken away or altered would make you a different person in a meaningful sense? And how much of a difference does the removal of that thing have to make you worthy of categorization as a separate, different person? Personality, shared life, biology, a shared immortal soul? It cannot solely be personality, can it? If this was the sole defining feature, a physically separate individual with an identical personality would be worth considering the same person. Is a person defined by the same physical mass? This simply reverts to the earlier mentioned idea of a shared biological shell defining someone as the same person through time. If someone was found to have identical biology to someone else, I doubt I would call them the same person. Surely it cannot be this doesn't seem to make much sense. If someone shared a biological shell but had a completely different personality and looked completely different, I don't think it would make any sense to call them the same person. But is it the shared singular biological shell, the shared organism, rather than the actual genetics itself? Is there any single concept worth defining as that which makes a person worthy of consideration as the same person, as their prior and future selves? Or should we settle with the idea that the answer is a somewhat incoherent mashup of multiple features? Anyone who knows anything about philosophy will know of a famous thought experiment regarding what we are discussing now, the metaphysics of identity. This thought experiment is called the Ship of Theseus. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that name wrong. The basic thought experiment concerns a ship which on a voyage gradually has its parts swapped out until all of them have eventually been changed. The question regards whether or not this is the same ship on its arrival to its destination as the ship which left. No doubt you can see how significant this thought experiment is to what I am discussing now, which represents little more than a swapping out of the ship with a human. This arguably makes things even more complex due to new variables such as biology and personality, as well as the implications of such an idea on how we not only communicate, but also understand others and ourselves. If a person was to completely change their personality, would they become a different person? If a person was to completely change their biological form, would they become a different person? What if someone's consciousness and personality jumped from one biological form to another? Would that make them the same person? If they were in a new organism, a new physical mass? What if they did both change their personality and biological form? Would they be a different person then and only then? Is there a utility in viewing them as the same person or as a different person? Does memory play a role in someone being the same person? If they perceived they were the same person, is that enough to define them as such? And if so, does that mean everyone suffering from extreme memory loss ceases to be the same person? Because being the same person is defined by shared memory. Keep in mind that when I say same, I mean same in a very fundamental sense. People change a little bit constantly, but I'm concerned with at what point we decide someone is not just a little different from their past self, but so different they are worth viewing as a distinctly and fundamentally different person, just as similar to random people around them as their past self, and just as worthy of consideration as this past self as they are as any stranger. There are differences between you in the past, present, and future, but does this make you a different person in a more fundamental sense? I think this question is outstandingly complicated, and trying to base our understandings of shared personhood with prior and future selves on rational standards will likely lead to us having to radically change how we view ourselves, others, and what it means to be a distinct person. We could take this in a number of directions, some of which are morally speaking likely more desirable than others. Pure biological consideration condemning one person to being viewed as the same person forever could be viewed as unethical, particularly if they changed greatly and wanted recognition of that change. People knowing they will be recognized as a new self if they reform and changed could also incentivize such behavior and mean more people try to redeem themselves and improve themselves. I don't think I can give a definitive answer to this question regarding the metaphysics of identity, at least not yet as the current version of myself. I think I would be foolish to even try with my very limited current understanding of such a topic and question. But I think these things should be considered regardless, and I consider them. I think it is very important we consider the answers. We are rational beings and beings curious about such fundamental issues relating to how we understand ourselves and others. Trying to answer such questions is in a sense part of our nature, and we should consider such things as greatly important. These things are important to understanding how we view ourselves now and how we could view ourselves in the future. This is a question worth considering and a deeply interesting and important one. As I have said before, it is almost indescribably important to our understanding of ourselves and everyone else. This is something I think you could consider for many years and not come up with a definitive answer. Here my goal is simply to touch on the surface of this issue, and I think I have done just that. I will no doubt think about this issue more in the future, and I have no doubt you probably will as well. Now, on to the next part. What makes a person a person? In my mind, this question has considerably more potential to lead to some dark places, and it can be a very dangerous question indeed. Dehumanization and all that horrible stuff is relevant to this question. But the highly ideological actors who have before hijacked these conversations with immorality and idiocy should not put us off considering issues as important as this one. I will likely be somewhat shorter in my consideration of this question. What variable or factor defines personhood, and what is the implication of defining personhood by such a variable or factor? It could simply be put a human as anyone who is biologically speaking a Homo sapien. This is indeed a commonly held standard by many people, and one that serves a utility. It could be argued rationality and morality are human qualities that define us from animals and make us who we are. Such a standard could be very dangerous and itself immoral and irrational. We will immediately get to questions about whether personhood should be applied to individuals who exhibit these traits, or whether there is a greater utility in simply applying it to humanity as a whole. Applying such a standard individually undeniably has the propensity to spawn countless ethical issues and injustices if people are deprived of humanhood. When we view humanhood as an idea which is applied individually, this can be perverted very easily and lead to some very bad things when immoral people take control of defining humanhood and assigning this label. A sliding scale of humanhood could be employed, but this could easily be abused, and in many ways it could be inherently flawed. We could say the most morally depraved, Nazis for example, are less human than the moral, as morality is a deeply human quality. This is basically an argument that immoral people are primitive lesser creatures. Now, whether this is even true or not is debatable. You could say that with calling people primitive, we could accidentally feed into racist narratives or other destructive and immoral ideas. I think a sliding scale of what makes a human has the capacity to be extremely destructive and harmful if it is taken to describe inherent differences, and not differences that are environmental and able to be remedied. Still, this can be a dangerous game, and the greatest care must be taken when playing it, if it is to be played at all. Morally, I dislike the idea of defining humanhood in such loaded and potentially dangerous ways. I dislike applying humanhood individually, and I dislike a sliding scale where some people are more human than others. It just sets the stage for dehumanization and needless hierarchy and cruelty. It has the potential to so easily be hijacked and used by the immoral. Saying that all biological Homo sapiens are humans, but some are more or less moral seems like a better idea, as it prevents the dangers of dehumanization. This just seems like a better choice to me. It may be broad, but I think it serves utility in averting the propensity of such standards to lead to unjust hierarchy, dehumanization, and the resulting cruelty. Defining humanhood by these standards, and particularly individually, is a dangerous game. I prefer a simple rules-based approach where all born and living Homo sapiens are granted humanhood, with their characteristics being considered in ways that do not lead to dehumanization and the moral depravity that follows. We lack one consistent standard of humanity as a society now, as can be seen whenever abortion as an issue comes up. Most people probably believe a human is anything birthed by a human that has a human biological form and is alive. Whether or not consciousness is even required is debatable, as is whether or not it should be required to make someone worthy of personhood. Whether someone has been born yet or not is also something which is viewed by many as very relevant to the idea of personhood, hence the abortion debate. When we discuss this, we should be searching for the definition of personhood which serves the greatest utility and leads to the best consequences for people. We want to find the definition of personhood that is the most moral. We ought to also be very careful of the implications any claim could have and who it could make human or deprive of humanhood. Also worth mentioning is the consequences of being deprived of the label of human. I could not come to a decisive conclusion on the earlier question, but on this one I think I can. Defining humanhood in deeply exclusionary ways based upon sliding scales or analyzing every individual is dangerous and can lead to great immorality. For the most part, it should be avoided. Such standards will be corrupted easily and will lead to dehumanization and exclusion very quickly. These dehumanizing standards lessen empathy and pave the road to cruelty, meaning we should be very wary of them and the danger they pose. Perhaps we could say a human is a born Homo sapien who is conscious. Morally, I think this is probably the most desirable understanding of humanhood, as it leads to the greatest utility and serves humanity and its collective interests to the greatest extent. I could flesh that position out in further depth, but it would probably take quite a long time. I will not do so here, but perhaps I will in the future. I hope you found my largely incoherent ramblings on these important questions somewhat interesting, and I hope you have some thoughts yourself. Feel free to share them. When discussing these issues, we only really have to keep two core things in mind: that we are thinking rationally, and that we are working to the most moral conclusions, and considering the morality of the implications of our ideas. As I have said before, ideas exist to help us understand what reality is, and what it ought to be. Our understandings should serve the greatest utility and lead to the best outcomes. So long as we are moral and rational, not too much can go wrong. My ideas here are half-baked, and that is fine. Ideas, you see, need criticism, and a lot of it, to become their best selves. I wrote this script quite a long time ago, but recently I found out that apparently this was an issue that the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke discussed. If you want to look into this topic further, he seems a good place to start.